cobwebs that we are clearly not using anymore, but I want to show you what it was for. One part of making whiskey involves drying out the barley, and I'll explain it better next door. But basically, we would have filled our furnace with coal or coke. We would have generated lots of heat. The hot air was blown back through this opening, and these openings weren't here. So we're standing at the bottom of a chimney with lots of hot air being forced in. Hot air, of course, naturally wants to rise up, and if you look up, you can see right through to the floor above. That's called a malting floor. I want you to imagine a thick layer of barley up there, and on top of that layer of barley were malt men. I say malt men, they might have started as young as 13. This is a malt shovel. Pass it round, feel the weight. Imagine using this shovel for 12 hours a day, every day, from the age of 13 or 14. Oh. Back-breaking toil. Get the hot air into that room. I've got this table, and I've got some props, and I've also got this graphic, which is really helpful for explaining the stages of making whiskey. I'm going to talk you up to step 6 before we move on. So, ingredients. Very simple, humble ingredients. Water, barley, yeast. There are hundreds of whiskies in Scotland. They all taste different, and they are all made with water, barley and yeast. Isn't that incredible? So, water. Our water comes from a natural spring, which runs right underneath the site. Our barley is grown right on our doorstep, because we're in what we call the Garden of Scotland. So the fields around here are extremely fertile and perfect for growing barley. This is what barley looks like if you're not sure. It's got the long whiskers, okay? Now, when it comes off the plant at harvest time, the seed or the grain is very, very hard. We want to open it up so we can access the flavour inside. This is a process called steeping, and it happens at the maltings, also a mile down the road, okay? What they do is they take the barley and they soak it and they drain it, and they soak it and they drain it, and they repeat the process until the barley thinks it's spring showers and bursts into life. So you're basically triggering germination. Now, this is what the barley wants to do. It wants to fully open up and start growing a green shoot. We don't actually want it to grow a green shoot because it would take out all that energy or flavour in doing so. So how do you stop the germination once you've started it? Well, that's what the malt men were doing. So by rotating that grain over hot air, you're killing the barley basically and stopping germination, okay? Now, can I have a show of hands for people who like a smoky or malty, yeah, kind of whiskey? I'm quite happy. But basically, I want you to imagine you're on the island of Islay, which is very famous for those smoky whiskies. 100 years ago, they're up there making their whiskey, they're filling their furnace with peat. Now, this is their only fuel source on the island of Islay. They didn't have coal, they didn't have access to much timber, and it's not just Islay, it's all the west coast of Scotland and the islands off the west coast of Scotland. So when they came to create their hot air to send upstairs to their malt men, it was with burning of peat. Does everyone know what peat is? Okay, so peat is semi-decomposed vegetation. You don't have to mine for it, it occurs on the surface. Tens of thousands of years of vegetation piling up on top of itself. The reason it doesn't fully decompose is because the soil is acidic, so it's like a preservative, okay? So it's got loads and loads of energy captured in this peat bog, so they burn this, okay? But when you burn this, as you know, it creates this incredibly intense smoky flavour. So if you want to create a smoky whiskey, that's what you would put in your furnace. As I say, the people on Islay had no choice. Back then, they could only make smoky whiskies. Now, of course, we all have choice, but we don't use peat, all right? So, we receive our malted barley, because that's what it's called. Now it's been through these steps, and we're ready to mill it. And we do milling and everything else right here at Glenkinchie. So when we take the barley, the malted barley, it looks like this. Then we run it through our mill, and it looks like this. And this is called the grist of the mill, okay? Now I want you to think of this like a little recipe, because we can change the flavour of whiskey depending on how we actually mill the grains. This is called a mash tun, T-U-N. It's kind of like a coffee pot, not exactly obviously, but I want you to imagine we're making a filter coffee. We're adding the grist of the mill into the bottom of that tank. we're adding lots and lots of very hot water, and the bottom of our tank has a filter. There's also a mechanical arm which is turning. And so you're just stripping out all that lovely flavour. You would end up with a hot coffee and coffee grounds. We end up with a hot wort, that's what it's called, the liquid is called wort. And the coffee grounds in our case is the grist, but now it's called draft. There's lots of funny words in this industry as well. Now remember I said the Wright brothers were feeding that to their cattle. You could make whiskey and then feed the barley to your cattle. Well, we're still doing it, but we're selling it to other people's cattle. We don't have cattle anymore. We used to have cattle. I want you to introduce you to Gregor. He's a very handsome chap. An award-winning Glenkinchie bull, which he won all the top awards. And we don't have the cattle anymore, but we sell our draft to the local East Lothian cattle. All right. So all of this process that I've just explained was all to make this delicious looking liquid here called wort. W-O-R-T. It's actually very tasty. It's very sweet. It is only barley and water.
Nu mai dacă era astea brutărie sau ceva.
Cool. So here you come everyone. We'll do another head count to make sure we get everyone. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Lovely. So as I say, the mash has been done for the day. So if you look in the window, you'll see the draft. It's drying out and it's going to get moved into a container outside. You'll see the mechanical arm, and if you imagine it earlier, it was full of that hot water making that lovely sweet wort. So have a look in the window.
Is it warm? Is it hot or warm?
It's pretty tasty.
Oh.
Like I think this is really good and hot.
Yeah.
Village that was built in 1880, we have generations of the same family living and working at Glenkinchie. There's a chap right at the top, and his name is Sean Christie, and he's an operator right now. He is the 5th generation of the Christie family to live here and work here. He has 2 children. Maybe one of them will end up running the place, you never know. But that just gives you an idea of the connection that we have with the people at Glenkinchie. We have this photograph here. That's 100 years old, and there's two of these relatives, this chap and this chap, are his second great uncles or something like that. So we're going to add yeast, the third ingredient, and we're going to start making alcohol. In very simple terms, whiskey is distilled beer. That's the tool over here. So we're going to make beer. So we take our non-alcoholic wort, we add the yeast, fermentation starts, and we end up with what we call wash. It tastes like beer. It's 9% strong beer. And it's nice, I've tried it. There are choices to be made about flavour for every distillery in Scotland. Some distilleries choose to do a 2-day fermentation. We call that short fermentation. So for only 2 days, you let the wort react with the yeast and become wash, and that will bring out those cereal and nutty flavours. Okay? At the other end of the spectrum, some distilleries do a 5-day long fermentation, and they will bring out really sweet tropical fruit flavours in their whiskey. Now at Glenkinchie, we do a 3-day fermentation, an average fermentation, because we want to keep bringing out that fresh and flowery lowland quality. Okay? So, after days we have our wash, 9%, tastes like beer. Now we're going to put it through distillation because we need a liquid, a spirit, to be 70%. Very, very strong. So, here at Glenkinchie we have two beautiful copper stills. We're going to see them in a second. This one is actually the largest pot still on mainland Scotland. Huge. We take the wash and we fill it up to here. We heat it up from underneath like a kettle. We basically want the temperature to get to about 80 degrees Celsius because that's when alcohol starts to boil, but water doesn't. We want to lift the alcohol as a vapour and leave the water behind. That's how we're going to concentrate the alcohol. So as the temperature gets to 80 degrees, vapours start to lift up and they make contact with the inside of that copper still. It's very important that we use copper because it actually acts like a sponge and it reacts with the vapours and takes out unwanted elements and flavour. It also takes all the colour out, so that's not how we get the colour in whiskey, okay? So, the vapours that make it to the top, they are alcohol vapours. They travel down this line arm and outside into a big tank full of water, and within the tank are copper coils to continue through the copper, but they're getting cooled down. So they've gone from 9% to about 23%, and it's already crystal clear. But that's not strong enough. Remember, we're on 70%. So we take that liquid and we put it into our second still. So we double distill. We repeat the process again, and the liquid that comes off the second still is what I was calling rocket fuel. Remember, every time that bell was rung, these people were lining up and drinking this. Now, I'm not allowed to let you drink this, but put your hand out. I'm going to spray it on your hand. Rub your hands together and then smell your hands. So, if we stand in this space just now, I've never seen that amount of steam come out of washback, so we're going to be careful because I don't know how hot it is, okay? But if you have a look, you can see there's 6 different washbacks all working together. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. They're actually 5 meters deep. So let's walk past that one, don't want to hear the steam. Let's go to the back of the room. So they start downstairs. This is just the top. They're 5 meters deep and 40,000 litre capacity. So that's a lot of beer. And we have 6. They're made of pine. Each tank will last 60 years at least before we need to get a new one. So it's very sustainable. There's the operator, alright. We're okay. Okay, so have a look. If you can look in the windows, please feel free to have a look. You might see some activity. It's actually quite an active thing for organizations. There's a step up here for shorter people. So the smell changes with every part of production. This smell is more like sulfur. So that's the very big pot still I was telling you all about. It's actually brand new. Yeah, it's in right now. You see how hot it still is.
Ale borchotu. Aha, borchotu.
We get all our barley delivered, as I said, and it just goes into this hopper. So that's all we need now is the hopper and some storage. The rest of this whole building was designed for all the malting processes that I told you about, but of course we're not doing them on site anymore. So it's all, some of it's storage, some of it's part of the visitor experience, some of it's offices, but it's not being used for malting anymore. And that can take 12 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. So let's go and have a look at that.
To nie dobrze.
Notice there's been quite a few rules already about ingredients and things like that. Another set of rules apply to maturation. The minimum requirement for whiskey, it has to be 40% alcohol. We're not allowed to call it whiskey if it's 39.9% alcohol. And that's why we start as high as 70. Because when we put this liquid in the cask, that crystal clear liquid at 70%, and we leave it for a year, and it keeps going on and on and on, it lowers itself in alcohol volume and physical volume. We call it the angel's share. You may have heard of this term. Yes. But basically, back in the days, they used to think the whiskey was escaping. It was rising up to heaven and the angels were taking their share. So it's a very poetic way to describe evaporation. In Scotland, because of our cold climate, we only lose up to 2% a year. So that's not very much. In hotter climates, you could lose up to 20% a year. So, you start at 70%, you leave it in the cask, 12 years perhaps. When it comes out, it could be as high as 60%. And then we water it down to 40% or 43%, the sort of strength that you're used to drinking, all right? Now, these tags are also important. It tells you where the spirit was made and when it went into the cask, and its own unique tracking number. At the moment, there's just under 30 million casks in Scotland. Now that's pretty impressive, especially when you know there's only 5 million people. So we're completely outnumbered by whiskey and sheep, by the way. But yeah, so 30 million casks, that's a lot of drunk angels, isn't it? But it's all happening, all maturing away. Minimum, that whiskey has to stay in there for 3 years and a day. We're not even allowed to call it whiskey until it's been in there for 3 years and a day. And it has to be matured in Scotland for it to be called Scotch, okay? So the definition of a single malt is a whiskey that's made in Scotland from 100% malted barley in one single location. That's the definition. There's no such thing as a double malt. People ask me that. It's not a thing, okay? So we've got options. We need to get the casks from somewhere. We like a cask that's already been used, because if it's already been used, it's got some lovely coating on the inside, it's got colour and it's got flavour. So traditionally, for hundreds of years, we've been using port and sherry casks from Europe, Portugal and Spain. And then since the 1930s, after Prohibition in the States, when they started making bourbon again, we started buying up as many bourbon barrels as we could, because they're only allowed to use their casks once. Then they're looking to get rid of them and buy some new lovely virgin oak, American oak casks. So we've been getting them sent to us in parts like this. No, it's not like this. Think of it like IKEA. Okay, so it comes to us in parts. Then all these parts are taken to our cooperage, and our very skilled coopers make them into the casks that you see today. But what's really important is what's going on the inside. So we lay down what we call a carbon layer. We hold them over a big furnace and toast the inside. And then we can actually scratch back into the wood itself if we want to bring out more flavour. If you are using a bourbon cask, you're expecting creamy sweetness, that smell we can all smell in this room. If you're using a European cask, you would expect port and sherry, red wine influence, or dark fruits, okay? Now, the Americans charge us about £100 each for each cask, which seems reasonable, considering we can use it for about 100 years. But the Europeans, they're charging us about £5,000 for one single cask, because they don't have to sell them, they know we want them, so the price just goes up and up. So we use far less of the European casks now than we used to. And now we're actually thinking smart. We're actually using tequila casks, Jamaican pot rum, Japanese whiskey, beer, white wine, red wine. If it's an oak wood cask, we can try it. And there's been some really exciting innovations recently. There's a Lagavulin with a tequila finish, which is supposed to be, you're nodding vigorously. Have you tried it?
They sell it in San Francisco.
Yes.
It's good.
Well, I don't like Lagavulin, but for those that do, it's a very, very successful pairing of two flavours. So I think that's really exciting. We're not just stuck in the past. We're not just relying on port and sherry and bourbon. We're trying all sorts of cool ideas, all right? So we're going to go into the tasting room now, because we've got the two Glenkinchies to try, and I'm going to continue talking about maturation in those two examples, and then we're going to talk about blending as well. Unless anyone's got any questions before we move into the gallery for our tasting. Yes? It's not allowed on the label. In this bottle, half the liquid is something called single grain, Grain whiskey. You can make single grain whiskey all over the world, and they make it out of maize and rye and wheat and anything you like. In this instance, we make it with wheat, and it's made in a distillery called Cameron Bridge, which has been running for 200 years. every single bottle of Johnnie Walker is half full of this wheat-based whiskey. They don't really tell you about it, it's not a secret, but it's just that's what they do. And when you taste it on its own, it's incredibly gentle. So wheat has far less flavour than barley, and it's like coconut and vanilla. It's very, very sweet. The other half of this bottle has about 30 single malts in there, from all over Scotland. So you've got some from Islay, the smoky ones, you'll have the Highlands, Speyside, the very gentle, smooth ones, and the Lowlands are represented by Glenkinchie, okay? So you've got all sorts going on in there, and the wheat-based whiskey is like, they call it the blender's friend. So if you imagine you're taking all these really punchy, kind of, you know, aggressive whiskies, if you like, the wheat just smooths up and rounds everything up and makes a blend very smooth on the palate, makes it very enjoyable. If you look at whiskey or Scotch whiskey as a global drink, 9 bottles out of 10 are blended. So this is how most of the world drink their Scotch. Okay? So with that in mind, you're going to encounter smokiness, because there's definitely smoky whiskies in this.